The city never sleeps, they say. But for 17-year-old Daniel Carter, the city never felt more awake than during those quiet hours just before dawn. That's when he'd open his eyes in the corner of a parking garage on Michigan Avenue, carefully fold the worn blanket he'd gotten from a church donation bin 3 months ago, and prepare for another day of being invisible. Daniel hadn't always been homeless. Just 8 months ago, he had a bed, a roof over his head, and something that resembled stability. He'd been in foster care since he was 9 years old, moving from home to home, never quite belonging anywhere. When he turned 17 and aged out of the system, the state handed him a garbage bag with his belongings, a list of homeless shelters, and wished him good luck. Just like that, he was on his own. The first few weeks were the hardest. Daniel remembered crying himself to sleep under a highway overpass, wondering how his life had come to this. But tears don't put food in your stomach or keep you warm at night. So he learned. He learned which restaurants threw out food at closing time. He learned which public restrooms he could use to clean up without being chased away. He learned that the public library opened at 9 in the morning, offering warmth, bathrooms, and a chance to feel human again, even if just for a few hours. Most people walked right past Daniel every single day. In their expensive coats and polished shoes, rushing to their important jobs and comfortable homes, they looked through him like he was made of glass. Sometimes that hurt more than the hunger or the cold. Being invisible felt like being erased, like the world had decided he didn't matter anymore. But Daniel refused to let the streets take away his dignity. Every morning, without fail, he'd wash his face and hands in the library bathroom. He'd comb his hair with his fingers and make sure his clothes were as clean as possible, even if they were old and worn. His mother, before she passed away when he was 8, had always told him that how you carry yourself matters. Even now, living in a parking garage, he tried to remember that November in Chicago is brutal. The wind cuts through you like a knife, and the temperature drops so low that your bones ache. On this particular evening, as the sun disappeared behind the tall buildings and darkness crept in, Daniel knew he needed to find somewhere warmer to spend the night. The parking garage would be too cold tonight. He could already see his breath forming little clouds in the air. He walked through the Gold Coast neighborhood, a part of the city where wealth lived behind ornate doors and beautiful windows. The townhouses here probably cost more money than Daniel could imagine. Sometimes he'd walk through this area just to remember that somewhere, people were warm and safe and didn't have to worry about where they'd sleep tonight. That's when he noticed something odd. Smoke was coming from one of the townhouses. Not the normal kind of smoke you'd see from a chimney on a cold evening. This smoke was darker, thicker, and it was seeping out from places where smoke shouldn't be coming from. Daniel stopped walking. Other people passed by, barely glancing at the house. Maybe they thought it was nothing. Maybe they were too busy to care. But something in Daniel's gut told him this wasn't right. He moved closer to the building, his heart starting to beat faster. Through one of the first-floor windows, he could see orange light flickering. Flames. The house was on fire. For a moment, Daniel froze. His mind raced with thoughts. This wasn't his problem. This was a rich person's house in a rich neighborhood. They had insurance. They had everything. What did it have to do with him? He was just a homeless kid trying to survive. But then he heard it. A woman's voice, screaming for help from somewhere on the second floor. The sound was desperate, terrified, cutting through the evening air like a siren. Daniel's feet moved before his brain could catch up. He ran toward the house, his worn sneakers pounding against the sidewalk. The heat hit him as soon as he got close. He could feel it radiating from the building, could smell the acrid scent of burning wood and fabric. He looked around frantically. Should he call for help? He didn't have a phone. Should he wait for someone else to do something? But the woman's screams were getting weaker, more desperate. There wasn't time. In the small garden in front of the house, Daniel spotted a large, decorative rock. Without thinking twice, he grabbed it and hurled it through the front window. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and immediately smoke poured out of the opening. Daniel pulled his thin jacket over his mouth and nose, knowing it wouldn't do much but hoping it would help somehow. He climbed through the window, cutting his hand on a piece of broken glass but barely feeling it. The inside of the house was chaos. Flames were climbing up the walls in the living room, consuming curtains and furniture. The heat was incredible, like standing too close to an oven, but worse, much worse. The woman's voice called out again from upstairs. Daniel couldn't see much through the thick smoke. His eyes were already burning, tears streaming down his face. Every breath felt like swallowing fire, but he pushed forward, finding the staircase and starting to climb. The stairs were still intact, but he could hear creaking sounds all around him. The house was falling apart. He knew he didn't have much time. Each step felt like it took forever, and his lungs were screaming for clean air. When he reached the second floor, the smoke was even thicker. He dropped to his hands and knees, remembering something he'd learned in a school fire drill years ago. Stay low where the air is clearer. He crawled down the hallway, following the sound of coughing and crying. He found the bedroom at the end of the hall. The doorway was blocked by flames, but through them, he could see a woman collapse near the window. She was trying to crawl, trying to reach the window, but she couldn't make it. The smoke had gotten to her. Daniel looked at the wall of fire between him and the woman. Every instinct in his body told him to turn around, to save himself, to get out while he still could. Nobody would blame him. He was just a kid. He'd already done more than most people would. But in that moment, Daniel thought about all the times people had walked past him on the street. All the times he'd been invisible. All the times nobody had helped him when he needed it most. He thought about his mother and what she would want him to do. He took a deep breath of the smoky air, pulled his jacket tighter around his face, and ran through the flames. The heat was unbearable. He felt it burning his skin, singeing his hair. But he made it through. He grabbed the woman under her arms and started dragging her toward the window. She was barely conscious, her body heavy and limp. Daniel's strength was fading fast. The smoke had filled his lungs, and every movement felt like lifting weights. But he kept going, inch by inch, pulling the woman across the floor until they reached the window. With the last of his strength, he forced the window open and started screaming for help into the night air below. Daniel's screams for help echoed through the quiet street, but nobody seemed to hear him. Or maybe they heard him and didn't care. He looked down from the second-floor window. The ground seemed so far away, and jumping with an unconscious woman wasn't an option. Behind him, he could hear the fire getting louder, angrier, consuming everything in its path. The woman in his arms was barely breathing. Her face was covered in soot, and her body had gone completely limp. Daniel's mind raced. He'd gotten this far, but what now? What was he supposed to do? He was just a 17-year-old kid who'd been living in a parking garage. He wasn't a firefighter. He wasn't a hero. He was just Daniel. Then his eyes caught something. Just below the window, there was a small balcony roof that covered the first-floor patio. It wasn't much, maybe 8 feet down, but it was better than nothing. If he could somehow get the woman onto that roof, maybe they'd have a chance. Daniel looked back at the doorway. The flames had grown bigger, spreading across the ceiling now. He could hear cracking sounds as the structure of the house started to weaken. Time was running out, and he knew it. With strength he didn't know he had, Daniel lifted the woman up toward the window. She was heavier than she looked, or maybe he was just that exhausted. His arms shook as he maneuvered her through the window opening, trying desperately not to drop her. The smoke was so thick now that he could barely see what he was doing. Carefully as possible, he lowered her down toward the balcony roof. His hands gripped her wrists, and he leaned out of the window as far as he dared. The heat from the fire behind him felt like it was cooking his back. His arms screamed in pain, but he held on. Finally, when his arms couldn't stretch any further, he had to let go. The woman dropped the last few feet onto the balcony roof with a heavy thud. Daniel's heart stopped. Had he hurt her? Was she okay? But there was no time to think about that now. The room behind him was completely engulfed in flames. Daniel could feel his jacket starting to smoke. He climbed onto the windowsill, his legs shaking, and looked down at the balcony roof below. 8 feet didn't seem like much when you were standing on solid ground, but from up here it looked like a mile. He jumped. The landing knocked the wind out of him. Pain shot through his ankles and knees, but nothing felt broken. He rolled to the side and immediately crawled over to the woman. She was still breathing, but just barely. He positioned himself between her and the window above, using his body as a shield. Just then, as if the universe was adding insult to injury, flames shot out of the window Daniel had just jumped from. He felt the heat wash over them, singeing the back of his neck and hair. He pressed himself closer to the woman, protecting her with everything he had. That's when he finally heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens. Fire trucks were coming. 2 neighbors had finally noticed the commotion and called for help. They stood in their yards, staring up at Daniel and the woman on the balcony roof, their phones in their hands. One of them was yelling, trying to tell Daniel that help was on the way, but Daniel's ears were ringing so badly he could barely make out the words. The fire trucks arrived with lights flashing and sirens blaring. Firefighters jumped out and immediately got to work. A ladder was extended up to the balcony roof within seconds. 2 firefighters climbed up while others started battling the flames that were now consuming most of the second floor. One firefighter, a woman with kind eyes visible through her mask, reached Daniel first. She checked the unconscious woman quickly, then radioed down for a stretcher. Another firefighter helped Daniel stand up. His legs felt like rubber, and he realized he was shaking uncontrollably. They got the woman down first, carefully securing her on a stretcher before rushing her to the waiting ambulance. Then it was Daniel's turn. A firefighter helped him down the ladder, supporting him when his legs nearly gave out halfway down. The moment Daniel's feet touched solid ground, paramedics surrounded him. They put an oxygen mask over his face and started checking his vitals. Daniel wanted to pull the mask off and ask if the woman was okay, but he couldn't seem to make his arms work properly. Everything felt distant and fuzzy, like he was watching everything happen to someone else. They loaded him into an ambulance. Through the open doors, he could see the house fully engulfed in flames now. Dozens of firefighters were working to put it out, their hoses spraying massive streams of water. The whole street was lit up with red and blue lights from emergency vehicles. At the hospital, everything became a blur. Doctors and nurses moved around him, asking questions he couldn't quite answer. They treated his burns, which turned out to be mostly first degree, with a few second-degree burns on his hands and back. They gave him medicine for the pain and fluids through an IV for the smoke inhalation. Someone told him he was lucky to be alive. Lucky. Daniel almost laughed at that word. He'd been homeless for 8 months, living in a parking garage, and now he was in a hospital bed with burns all over his body. Some luck, but then he thought about the woman. At least she was alive. At least he'd gotten to her in time. That had to count for something. A nurse came by with papers for him to fill out. Name, address, emergency contact, insurance information. Daniel stared at the forms. What was he supposed to write? His address was a parking garage. His emergency contact was nobody. His insurance was nothing. He left most of the form blank and just wrote his name. The nurse looked at the paper, then at him, and something in her expression softened. She didn't say anything, just nodded and took the form away. Later that evening, after the doctors had checked on him one more time, Daniel did what he always did. He left. He simply walked out of the hospital when nobody was looking. They'd done what they needed to do, patched him up, made sure he wasn't going to die. Now it was time to go. The night air felt cold against his skin after the warmth of the hospital. His body ached with every step, and the burns on his hands throbbed with pain, but he kept walking. He had nowhere to go, but he kept walking anyway. Daniel made his way back to his parking garage, back to his corner, back to his blanket. As he lay down on the cold concrete, he thought about what had happened. He'd run into a burning building. He'd saved someone's life, but tomorrow he'd wake up and still be homeless. Nothing had changed, except everything had changed. Daniel just didn't know it yet. What he didn't know was that security cameras from a neighbor's house had captured everything. Every moment of his brave rescue had been recorded. The footage showed a skinny teenager in worn clothes breaking a window and running into a burning house without a second thought. It showed him carrying a woman to safety, shielding her with his own body as flames erupted around them. And what Daniel really didn't know was that the woman he'd saved wasn't just any woman. Her name was Catherine Montgomery, and she was married to one of the wealthiest men in Chicago, a tech billionaire named Robert Montgomery, who was about to turn the city upside down looking for the boy who'd saved his wife's life. But that night, as Daniel closed his eyes in his parking garage, trying to ignore the pain from his burns and the exhaustion in his bones, he had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. He had no idea that his face would soon be on every news channel in the country. He had no idea that his simple act of courage would spark something much bigger than himself. All he knew was that he'd done the right thing. And for a kid who felt invisible most days, that was enough. Robert Montgomery was sitting in a hospital waiting room when the doctors finally came out with news about his wife. He'd been on a business trip to New York when he got the call that would change his life. "Your wife was in a fire. She's in the hospital. Come home immediately." The private jet couldn't fly fast enough. During that entire flight, Robert sat with his head in his hands, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Catherine was his everything. They'd been married for 28 years, and he still loved her as much as the day they met. The thought of losing her was unbearable. When the doctors told him she was going to be okay, that someone had pulled her out of the fire just in time, Robert broke down and cried right there in the hospital hallway. He wasn't a man who cried often. But this was different. Who saved her? He asked the doctor. I need to thank them. I need to find them. The doctor shook his head. We don't know. A young man brought her out, but he left the hospital before anyone could get his information. The paramedics said he looked like he might be homeless, but they weren't sure. Homeless. The word stuck in Robert's mind. Someone with nothing had risked everything to save his wife. 2 days later, when Catherine finally woke up, Robert was sitting by her bedside, holding her hand. Her voice was raspy from the smoke and she was weak, but she was alive and awake and talking. That was all that mattered. There was a boy, Catherine whispered. I remember a boy. He came through the fire. I thought I was dreaming, that I was already dead and seeing an angel. But he was real. I'm going to find him, Robert promised. I'm going to find this boy and thank him properly. That's when Robert did what he did best. He threw money and resources at the problem. He hired 3 of the best private investigators in Chicago. He offered a $50,000 reward for any information leading to the identity of the young man who'd saved his wife. He had his assistant contact every hospital, shelter, and social service agency in the city. But the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down from the Montgomerys, came forward with security camera footage. Her camera, pointed toward the street, had captured everything. Robert watched the video over and over again. He saw a skinny teenager in worn clothes stop in front of their burning house. He saw the boy hesitate for just a moment before grabbing a rock and smashing through the window. He watched this kid, who couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds, climb into a burning building without any protection, without any help, without a second thought. The video showed the boy emerge on the balcony roof minutes later, shielding Catherine with his own body as flames shot out above them. Robert's hand shook as he watched. This kid had saved his wife's life. Get this footage to every news station in Chicago, Robert told his assistant. I want this boy's face on every screen in the city. Someone has to know who he is. By that evening, the video had gone viral. Local news stations picked it up first, running it as their lead story. Mystery teen hero saves woman from burning building. Within hours, it jumped to national news. By the next morning, the video had been viewed over 5 million times online. The internet did what the internet does best. People started sharing the video with captions like "Faith in Humanity Restored" and "Not all heroes wear capes." News anchors called it one of the most selfless acts they'd ever witnessed. Social media was flooded with people trying to identify the mysterious young hero, but nobody seemed to know who he was. Robert increased the reward to $100,000. He went on television himself, pleading for information. This young man saved my wife's life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I just want to thank him. Please, if anyone knows who he is, help me find him. 3 weeks went by, 3 long weeks of dead ends and false leads. People called claiming to be the hero, but none of them were. Others called with tips that led nowhere. Robert was starting to lose hope. Meanwhile, Daniel was watching all of this unfold from his usual spot at the public library. He'd come in one morning to use the bathroom and warm up, and there on every computer screen in the library was his own face. The security camera footage played on loop on the news websites. Daniel's stomach dropped. He recognized himself immediately, even though the video quality wasn't perfect and his face was partially obscured by smoke and shadow. That was him climbing through the window. That was him on the balcony roof. His first instinct was to run, to leave the library and never come back. He didn't want this attention. He didn't want to be on the news or have people looking for him. He'd done what anyone should have done, and now he just wanted to be left alone. But everywhere he went, he saw his own face, on newspapers in the boxes on the street, on television screens in store windows. People were talking about him, calling him a hero, sharing the video over and over again. Daniel felt trapped. He'd spent 8 months being invisible, and now suddenly everyone was looking for him. It made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite explain. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a homeless kid who'd gotten lucky and managed to save someone. That was all. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had worked at the public library for 30 years. She'd seen countless homeless people come through the doors over the decades, and she'd learned to recognize them. Daniel had been coming to the library every day for months now. Always polite, always quiet, always cleaning himself up in the bathroom before sitting down to read or use the computers. She'd noticed him watching the news coverage about the mystery hero. And she'd noticed how uncomfortable he looked. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but something about the way Daniel watched that video, the way his hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the news articles, made her wonder. One morning, she approached him carefully while he was sitting at a computer. "Daniel," she said softly. She'd learned his name months ago, during one of their quiet conversations about books. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Daniel looked up, his eyes wary. He nodded but didn't say anything. Mrs. Patterson sat down in the chair next to him. She didn't point at the screen or make any accusations. She just sat there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "That young man they're looking for," she said finally. "The one who saved that woman. They really want to thank him. The husband has been on television every day begging for information." Daniel stared at his hands. "Yeah, I've seen. The family seems nice," Mrs. Patterson continued. "Not looking to cause trouble. Just looking to say thank you to someone who did something incredibly brave." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I didn't do it to get thanked. I just did what needed to be done." Mrs. Patterson's heart squeezed in her chest. She'd been right. This boy, this kind, quiet boy who came to the library every day and never caused any trouble, was the hero everyone was searching for. "I know you didn't," she said gently. "But sometimes letting people say thank you is a gift you give to them, not just something they give to you. That man needs to thank you, Daniel. His wife is alive because of you. Let him have that closure." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and she could see the fear in his eyes. Fear of attention, fear of being seen, fear of everything changing. "What if they ask questions?" he said. "About where I live? About why I was there?" "Then you tell them the truth," Mrs. Patterson said. "And you let them help you if they offer. There's no shame in accepting help, especially from people who genuinely want to give it." Daniel thought about this for a long time. Days, actually. He kept coming to the library, kept watching the news coverage, kept seeing Robert Montgomery's face pleading for information. And slowly, very slowly, something inside him shifted. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe letting these people thank him wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about giving them peace, letting them express their gratitude, allowing them to close this chapter of their lives. Finally, after 3 weeks of hiding in plain sight, Daniel made a decision. He asked Mrs. Patterson if she would help him set up a meeting with the Montgomerys. Somewhere quiet, somewhere private, somewhere he wouldn't be ambushed by cameras and reporters. Mrs. Patterson smiled and squeezed his hand. "I'll make the call right now." The coffee shop Mrs. Patterson chose was small and tucked away on a quiet side street. It wasn't the kind of place that billionaires usually went to, with its mismatched chairs and chipped coffee mugs. But that was exactly why she'd picked it. Daniel needed to feel comfortable, not overwhelmed. Daniel arrived 15 minutes early. He'd spent an hour that morning in the library bathroom, washing up as best as he could. His clothes were still worn and didn't fit quite right, but they were clean. Mrs. Patterson had offered to buy him something new to wear, but he'd refused. If these people wanted to thank him, they needed to see who he really was. Not some cleaned-up version, just Daniel. He ordered a hot chocolate with the few coins he had in his pocket and sat in the corner booth, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. His hands were still bandaged from the burns, though they were healing. Every time he looked at them, he remembered the heat of the fire, the weight of Catherine Montgomery in his arms, the sound of her desperate breathing. When Robert and Catherine Montgomery walked through the door, Daniel recognized them immediately from the news coverage. But seeing them in person was different. Robert was tall, probably in his early 60s, with gray hair and tired eyes. Catherine was smaller, her face still showing the effects of the smoke inhalation. She moved slowly, carefully, like someone who'd been through something traumatic. The moment Catherine saw Daniel sitting in that corner booth, she burst into tears. Not quiet tears either. Big, sobbing, can't-catch-your-breath tears. She rushed over to him, and before Daniel could even stand up, she wrapped her arms around him and held on like he was the most precious thing in the world. Daniel froze. He wasn't used to being hugged. In 8 months of living on the streets, nobody had touched him except to push him away or tell him to move along. This felt strange and overwhelming and somehow right all at the same time. "Thank you," Catherine whispered into his shoulder, still crying. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Robert stood back for a moment, his own eyes wet with tears. Then he joined them, wrapping his arms around both Catherine and Daniel. The three of them stood there in that little coffee shop, holding on to each other while the barista pretended not to stare. When they finally sat down, Catherine wouldn't let go of Daniel's hand. She held it across the table like she was afraid he might disappear if she stopped touching him. "I need you to know something," Robert said, his voice shaking. "You gave me back my entire world. Catherine is my everything. Without her, I have nothing. All the money, all the success, all of it means nothing without her, and you gave her back to me." Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He'd never thought of it that way. He'd just thought about saving a person, not about saving someone's entire world. "I didn't really think about it," Daniel said quietly. "I just heard her screaming and I couldn't walk away. Anyone would have done the same thing." "But they didn't," Catherine said softly. "Other people walked by that house." "I know they did. The police told me. People saw the smoke and kept walking. But you didn't. You ran toward the danger when everyone else ran away from it." They talked for over an hour. Robert and Catherine asked Daniel about himself, and slowly, hesitantly, he told them his story. About his mother dying when he was young. About bouncing through foster homes for 8 years. About aging out of the system with nowhere to go. About the parking garage he'd been calling home. Catherine cried through most of it. Robert's jaw got tighter and tighter with each detail, his anger clearly building. Not at Daniel, but at a system that could fail a child so completely. Then came the moment Daniel had been dreading. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He placed it on the table between them. "There's a check in here for $100,000, Robert said. "It's the least we can do to thank you for what you did. This money can change your life, Daniel. You can get an apartment, go to school, start fresh. You deserve it." Daniel stared at the envelope. $100,000. He tried to imagine what that amount of money even looked like. It could solve every problem he had. He could eat regular meals. He could sleep in a real bed. He could stop being invisible. His hand reached toward the envelope, trembling. This was it. This was his way out. But then something stopped him. An image flashed through his mind. Tommy, a 16-year-old kid he'd met at a shelter 2 months ago. Tommy had also aged out of foster care. He was sleeping under a bridge now, trying to finish high school during the day while surviving on the streets at night. Daniel thought about Lisa, a girl he'd shared a meal with at a soup kitchen. She was 17 and 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go. He thought about Kevin and Michael and Rachel and all the other kids he'd met who were just like him. Kids the system had forgotten. Kids who were invisible. Daniel pulled his hand back from the envelope. Robert and Catherine looked confused. "Daniel?" Catherine said. "What's wrong?" Daniel took a deep breath. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. What he was about to say was crazy. It was probably the dumbest thing he'd ever do, but it was also the only thing that felt right. "I don't want the money," Daniel said quietly. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Robert and Catherine just stared at him like he'd grown a second head. You don't want it?" Robert said slowly, like he was trying to make sure he'd heard correctly. "I don't want it for myself," Daniel clarified, his words coming faster now. "I want something else, something bigger." And then he told them. He told them about all the kids he'd met on the streets. Kids who'd aged out of foster care just like him. Kids who were trying to go to school while sleeping in cars. Kids who were smart and talented and full of potential but had nowhere to go and nobody to help them. "There are so many of us," Daniel said, his voice getting stronger. "So many kids who fall through the cracks when they turn 18. The state just cuts us loose and expects us to figure it out. But how are we supposed to figure it out when we have no money, no support, no place to live?" He looked directly at Robert and Catherine, and his eyes were blazing with a passion he didn't know he had. "I don't need rescuing," Daniel said. "I'm going to be okay somehow. But there are hundreds of kids in this city alone who need help. Kids who need a safe place to live while they finish school. Kids who need someone to teach them how to find a job, how to open a bank account, how to do all the things that most people learn from their parents. Kids who just need a chance. Daniel pushed the envelope back across the table toward Robert. "What I want," he said, "is for you to help me build something. A place where kids who age out of foster care can go. A real program that gives them housing and support and a chance to become independent. That's what I want." Catherine's mouth had fallen open. Robert was just staring at Daniel like he was seeing him for the first time. "You want us to use this money to help other people?" Robert said slowly. "Instead of taking it yourself?" Daniel nodded. "I've been homeless for 8 months. I've survived this long, I can keep surviving. But some of these kids won't survive. Some of them will end up in jail or dead or addicted to drugs because they have no other options. If we could give them a safe place and some support, we could change that. We could actually change lives." The silence stretched on. Daniel started to worry that he'd made a mistake. Maybe they thought he was being ungrateful. Maybe they'd take back their offer entirely. Maybe he should have just taken the money and kept his mouth shut. Then Robert did something unexpected. He started laughing. Not a mean laugh, but a laugh of pure amazement and joy. "Catherine," he said, turning to his wife, "did we just get rescued by an actual angel?" Catherine was crying again, but this time she was smiling through her tears. "I think we did." Robert looked back at Daniel and there was something new in his eyes. Respect, admiration, maybe even a little bit of awe. "You want to build a transition home for foster youth?" Robert said. Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Robert picked up the envelope and tore it in half. Daniel's heart sank. But then Robert smiled. $100,000 isn't nearly enough for what you're talking about," Robert said. "If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right." 6 months later, Daniel stood in front of a beautiful 3-story building on the south side of Chicago. The old apartment complex had been completely renovated. Fresh paint covered the walls. New windows let in streams of sunlight. Inside, there were 20 furnished bedrooms, a commercial kitchen, a computer lab, a study room, and a common area that actually felt like a home. The sign above the door read, "New Horizons House, a safe place for tomorrow's leaders." Daniel had wanted to name it something simple, something that spoke to what the place really was, a second chance, a new beginning, a horizon that didn't look so dark anymore. Robert Montgomery hadn't just donated $100,000. He'd donated $5 million. He'd purchased the building, funded the renovations, and set up an endowment to keep the program running for years to come. But more than that, he'd gotten involved. Really involved. Catherine had thrown herself into the project too. She'd spent months researching programs for foster youth, talking to social workers and figuring out what these kids actually needed. Not what people thought they needed, but what would actually help them succeed. The program they created together was comprehensive. New Horizons House offered free housing for up to 2 years for youth who'd aged out of foster care. But it wasn't just a place to sleep. The program included job training, help with getting into college or trade schools, financial literacy classes, mental health counseling, and mentorship from successful adults who actually cared. Daniel had become the program's first resident and youth coordinator. He'd moved in 3 months ago when the renovations were finished. Having a real bed and a real room felt like a dream he kept expecting to wake up from. But every morning he'd open his eyes to see walls instead of a concrete parking garage ceiling. And he'd remember that this was real. This was his life now. He'd also gone back to school. With Catherine's help, he'd enrolled in a program to finish his high school diploma. It was hard, balancing his coordinator duties with his studies. But for the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he had a purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something that mattered. Today was the grand opening. News crews were set up outside, and local politicians were coming to give speeches about supporting foster youth. Daniel hated all the attention, but Robert had convinced him that publicity would help them secure more funding and help more kids. Inside the house, 19 other young people were getting ready for the event. 19 kids who'd been living on the streets or in their cars or couch surfing with friends. 19 kids who now had a safe place to call home. Daniel walked through the building, checking on everyone. In one room, he found Tommy, the 16-year-old he'd met at a shelter months ago. Tommy was wearing new clothes and had just gotten a job at a local grocery store. His eyes were bright with hope instead of hollow with despair. In another room, Lisa was rocking her 2-month-old baby. She'd given birth shortly after moving into New Horizons' house. The program had connected her with parenting classes and childcare support so she could finish school. Her daughter Hope was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Can you believe this is real?" Lisa whispered to Daniel. "Sometimes I think I'm going to wake up back under that bridge." "It's real," Daniel assured her. "And you're going to do amazing things. You and Hope both." The ceremony started at noon. Daniel stood on a small stage that had been set up in front of the building, trying not to throw up from nervousness. There had to be 200 people crowded on the street. Cameras pointed at him from every direction. Robert spoke first, telling the story of how Daniel had saved his wife's life. He told them about the young man who'd refused a reward for himself and instead asked to help others. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke, and more than a few people in the crowd wiped away tears. Then Catherine spoke. She talked about second chances and how everyone deserves to have someone believe in them. She talked about the 19 young people who were living in New Horizons' house, and how each of them had incredible potential if they were just given the right support. Then it was Daniel's turn. His hands shook as he stepped up to the microphone. Public speaking had never been his thing. But as he looked out at the crowd, he saw Mrs. Patterson from the library standing near the front. She gave him an encouraging nod. "I never wanted to be called a hero," Daniel started, his voice quiet but steady. "What I did that night running into that fire, that wasn't heroism. That was just doing what needed to be done. But you want to know what real heroism looks like? It looks like a kid who's sleeping in their car but still shows up to school every single day. It looks like a teenager working 2 jobs while trying to finish high school because nobody else is going to pay their bills. It looks like kids who've been told by the world that they don't matter but they keep fighting anyway." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "Every single person living in this house right now is a hero. They've survived things that would break most people. They've kept going when it would have been easier to give up. And now finally someone is telling them that they matter, that they're worth investing in, that they deserve a chance." Daniel looked directly at the cameras. "There are thousands of kids across this country who age out of foster care every year. Thousands of kids who end up homeless through no fault of their own. This house can help 20 of them. But what about the rest? What about the kid in Los Angeles sleeping on a bus? What about the girl in Miami who's about to give up on her dreams because she can't afford both rent and tuition? What about all of them?" He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is just the beginning. My hope is that New Horizons House becomes a model. That other cities, other states, other communities see what we're doing here and decide to do the same thing. Because every kid deserves a safe place to sleep. Every kid deserves someone to believe in them. Every kid deserves a chance at a future." The crowd erupted in applause. Daniel stepped back from the microphone, his heart pounding. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. After the ceremony, people lined up to talk to him. Other nonprofit leaders wanted to learn about the program. Donors wanted to contribute. A reporter from a national news outlet asked if she could do a feature story about New Horizons House. But the moment that mattered most came at the end of the day. After all the cameras had left and all the important people had gone home, Daniel sat on the front steps of New Horizons House with the other residents. They ordered pizza and just talked, sharing their stories and their dreams. Tommy wanted to be a nurse. Lisa wanted to study social work so she could help kids like them. Another resident, Alex, wanted to be a chef. Keisha wanted to be a teacher. Each of them had plans, goals, futures that suddenly seemed possible. As the sun set over Chicago, Daniel looked at the building behind him and the people around him. 8 months ago, he'd been sleeping in a parking garage with nothing but a worn blanket and fading hope. He'd felt invisible, forgotten, like he didn't matter to anyone. Now he was surrounded by people who'd become like family. He had a purpose that filled him with fire. And he'd learned something important. Sometimes the worst moments of your life can lead to the best outcomes, if you're brave enough to turn your pain into purpose. Robert and Catherine pulled up in their car just as the pizza boxes were being thrown away. They'd stayed away during the residents' private celebration, but they'd wanted to stop by and see how Daniel was doing. "How does it feel?" Robert asked, sitting down on the steps next to Daniel. Daniel thought about the question. How did it feel? It felt like finally being able to breathe after holding your breath for years. It felt like mattering. It felt like home. It feels like proof, Daniel said finally. Proof of what? Catherine asked. Proof that one person really can make a difference. You both could have just written me a check and moved on with your lives. But you didn't. You believed in this crazy idea and made it real. And now 20 kids have a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Robert shook his head. You've got it backwards, son. You're the one who made the difference. You ran into a burning building for a stranger. Then you turned down money you desperately needed because you were thinking about others instead of yourself. That kind of character is rare. You didn't just save Catherine's life that night. You reminded us what really matters in this world. 3 months later, Daniel's story hit national news in a big way. A documentary filmmaker had made a short film about New Horizons house. It won awards at film festivals and got picked up by a major streaming service. Suddenly, everyone was talking about the homeless teen who'd turned down a fortune to help others. The publicity brought in more donations than Robert had ever imagined. Within a year, 3 more New Horizons houses opened in different cities. Within 2 years, there were 15 across the country. Each one was home to young people who just needed someone to believe in them. Daniel finished his high school diploma and got accepted to a local college on a full scholarship. He decided to study social work, wanting to help create better systems for kids in foster care. But he still lived at New Horizons house and still worked as youth coordinator, because these weren't just residents to him, they were his family. On the 1-year anniversary of the fire, Daniel visited the lot where the Montgomery's townhouse had stood. A new house had been built in its place, modern and beautiful. But Daniel wasn't looking at the house. He was remembering that night. The fear, the heat, the desperate choice to run toward danger instead of away from it. If someone had told him then that this single act would lead to all of this, he never would have believed them. But life has a funny way of working out when you stop thinking about yourself and start thinking about others. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Tommy. Movie night at the house. You coming? He smiled and typed back. On my way home, home. What a beautiful word that had become.